13, 12, 11.
Hello and welcome to our first insaka this academic year. It's wonderful to have you back and thanks for joining us. For those joining us for the very first time, a very warm welcome. We've also had the pleasure of engaging with our audience from around the world since going digital. Welcome back and do let us know where you're joining us from. Now, for those who are new to Insakas, Insaka talks cover all areas of academia and attract both experts in the topics discussed, as well as a much broader research audience interested in all things Africa. And in that spirit, today's talks are on climate change, arguably a very topical subject that has become a matter of urgency in terms of how to repair damage, but with a bit of a tussle going on between taking real action and rhetoric. The first talk reflects on what net zero means for Africa and how Africa is engaging with it. The talk then looks at the implications of the COP26 outcomes for Africa and asks how these will likely play out at COP27. Our second talk presents the current knowledge of climate change in Africa and highlights research needs. It reflects on COP26 outcomes and the necessary next steps in policy and science towards closing the gap between action and rhetoric for COP27. We are delighted to welcome our two speakers today. Jessica Omukuti is a research fellow at the Institute for Science, Innovation and Society here at the University of Oxford. Her research is on governance of climate finance and strategies for net zero emissions in Africa and beyond. Jessica obtained her PhD in climate finance and climate justice from the University of Reading. She was awarded the Women in Climate Change Sciences Fellowship this year by the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences, and Jessica held last year's ESRC COP26 Fellowship. Our second speaker, Friederike Otto, is Senior Lecturer in Climate Science at Imperial College London, and until very recently was here at the University of Oxford. She researches the extent to which extreme weather events are made more likely or intense by climate change. Freddie is closely involved with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and authoring work for them on extreme weather events. She's the co-founder of and lead of the World Weather Attribution, for which she has been recognized on the Time 100 list. With that, a bit of housekeeping. Each speaker will give a 15-minute talk, and following both presentations, we'll have a Q&A session. Please post your questions in the chat box as we go along. And for anonymous posting, we have a Slido code, which is 9658888, and my colleagues in Pande will post it in the chat box for you. First up is Jessica. And Jessica's talk is titled, What Africa Means for the Global Net Zero Goal. Jessica, welcome.
Thank you, Otto. I was just trying to find my buttons there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, but we can't see your slides yet.
You can't see my slides. Okay, perfect. Okay, let me just share them. There. Okay, so. Share.
Yes.
Can you see them now?
Yeah, we can see them. And in a minute or so, or a few seconds, we're going to see the full screen. Yes, perfect.
That's it?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, thanks, Watu. Thanks for the invitation. Actually, I am really excited. This is the first time I get to talk about COP26 and my experiences. So I attended COP26 for the first time. It was a very exciting experience for me. And since then, I've been reflecting about how developing countries in general and the global south set within the outcomes of COP26, but also within global climate action. And today I'll be talking about where Africa sits. And so I started off thinking about what does net zero mean for Africa, but also what does Africa mean for the global net zero goal. As what we mentioned earlier, I am a research fellow at the University of Oxford. I work for Oxford Net Zero, and my work is thinking about inclusivity net zero. And Africa is one of the regions that I try to kind of to bring into these conversations together with Latin America and Asia. And so thinking about how can net zero be inclusive to developing countries and how what role can developing countries play in ensuring that that the net zero goal is achieved. And so I'll talk today about what Africa means for global net zero. So I just start off by saying that the recent IPCC Working Group 1 report had a very specific message for people in Africa, but those people working on supporting climate change action in Africa. And it said that Africa should prepare for more frequent and intense extreme events. In that, like the temperature projections for 1.5 are really high, going as high as, let's say, even 2 degrees. And then if we overshoot that, if we go as high as 4 degrees, the projections could be as high as 6 degrees. But also temperature, other than temperature, we have rainfall projections that increase in rainfall, but also some parts of Africa will see reductions in rainfall as global warming increases over the next few centuries. Over the next few decades. And that's a very, very clear message that, extreme events, and we've had quite a lot of those over the last few years, parts of sub-Saharan Africa have had droughts every year. For example, I was reading an article that said that parts of Somalia were experiencing like the 3rd or 4th consecutive drought this year, and they're more likely to have another drought next year. And so that means that preparing for these more frequent and intense extreme events will be really important to save lives and to protect development gains. But then that comes in net zero action. And so in 2015, the Paris Agreement set out a framework for how we would limit the warming and kind of keep warming to well below 2 degrees, which you've seen is already dangerous for Africa. And the Paris Agreement says that we should aim to reach peak global warming of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. And then and this is where Africa actually comes in. It says that developing countries will take a bit longer to peak, but then they should undertake very rapid reductions thereafter. And they should do that to make sure that they achieve a balance between emissions by sources and removals, but then in the framework, in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. And so this kind of gives Africa that space to, to peak a bit later as compared to other regions or countries, but also to do that to ensure that while they're peaking and while they're reducing their emissions much rapidly, they're doing that within the context of achieving their own sustainable development goals and ensuring that poverty is eradicated. And this is kind of a very good space for African countries to start, because it justifies the limited emissions or the low emissions that African countries or African communities or stakeholders have contributed towards global warming to date. It recognizes that countries have limited capacity, but they still need to develop first before they can reduce their emissions. But then this kind of the Paris Agreement provides a framework for net zero action, and this is what we have used kind of as a starting point for net zero action. And so the net zero emissions means that you kind of take you take a detour from your business as usual in terms of emissions. So reaching net zero emissions means that you transition to a low carbon economy that involves reducing your emissions by avoiding emissions, but also through removing your emissions, the emissions that you already put in the atmosphere, you remove them from the atmosphere. And then once you combine those two approaches, you reach a point where your emissions are net zero at a point in future. And so there's let's say, it's not an animation, is it? This diagram by WRI shows shows that based on this, we may reach net zero by just after 2050. But the Paris Agreement says that we aim to reach net zero by the second half of the century. And so going for net zero is kind of achieving that balance between avoiding emissions and removing emissions from the atmosphere. And this is kind of how you do that, when you do that, and through which mechanisms is kind of the net zero framework. And so we have the goal of 1.5, or limiting emissions well below 2 degrees by the second half of the century. And then the framework itself is how we do that and who is involved, how much they do, through which instruments. But then Africa's response, so we had the Paris Agreement in 2015, and then we've had a kind of a few people jumping onto the net zero framework, net zero climate action. But then up to today, I looked at the net zero tracker today, developed by my colleagues at the University of Oxford. Africa has been fairly slow in kind of adopting the net zero goals, making net zero commitments. For example, in this diagram, you see the only countries that have made very solid commitments are Nigeria in blue. I don't even think Nigeria has made a commitment. No, it's South Africa and Nigeria that have made commitments, kind of not really commitment pledges, but then every other country is in a space where they are still proposing it, they're thinking about proposing it, or they're in discussions about what their net zero commitments will be or what their net zero pledges will be. And so my point here, when I think with this slide, I'm saying that our net zero countries in Africa have been really slow to make their net zero commitments. Some other countries are still kind of holding back. For example, we see Kenya. There's a few countries in West Africa that are still taking their time in making net zero commitments. And that kind of shows, I'm not sure what shows, I think that shows either the deliberation that is still ongoing. It could also show a bit of hesitancy. It could also show a thing of let's wait and see how this plays out before we say anything, before we make commitments to reducing our emissions. And you can find a more interactive tracker. There's the net zero tracker. It's very interactive. You get to know what countries are thinking and what different businesses and corporations are thinking about net zero. But then if we want to understand, because very few countries have so far made commitments or pledges, I think we can start to understand Africa's response to net zero through the NDCs. And so a report that was released by the Africa NDC Hub for COP26 a few weeks ago in November showed that kind of almost half of the continent has updated their NDCs, and kind of the other half has only submitted their NDCs. And so for those who don't know, NDCs are nationally determined contributions that countries are supposed to submit every 5 years to say how much they will commit towards reducing their emissions. And so it's kind of 5 years plans where you say that I'll reduce my emissions by this much. And then after every 5 years, you're asked to go back and see whether you can revise those goals and increase your ambition. And so the first NDCs were submitted, I think, in around 2015. And the second round of NDCs, which we call revised NDCs or updated NDCs, were due in 2020. And only half of the continent has submitted those NDCs. But then adaptation plans kind of accompany, while NDCs were expected to kind of demonstrate adaptation or mitigation goals, national adaptation plans, the NAPs, were expected to demonstrate, adaptation goals. And very many countries are still developing national adaptation plans. And about, let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4, about 6 or 7 countries have submitted national adaptation plans. And this is by 2021. And then lastly, the long-term emission development plans, emission reduction development plans. So these, the UNFCCC expects countries and requested countries to submit plans for long-term emission reductions. And as you can see also here, there is only 2 countries that have done that. And that's kind of going back to the net zero tracker that I showed you. It's South Africa and is that, which country is that? Yeah, and so these 2 countries have submitted long-term emission development plans, which means that the rest of about probably a third of the rest of the countries, I can't count them, are in the process of developing them. And so kind of the hesitancy says a lot about countries willingness or preparedness to commit to net zero plans. But then if we go a bit further, so these are the kind of very recent NDC submissions. If we go kind of a bit back and look at the first round of NDC submissions, we see the kind of underlying thinking behind it. And so the first NDCs that were submitted were very much adaptation based in a sense. So they made adaptation goals and they made adaptation commitments, but also requested, made mitigation commitments, but a lot of those were conditional in the sense that they said that we would achieve these goals on condition that we receive funding for it. And so you can see, for example, adaptation financing for sub-Saharan Africa was about, let's say, how much is that? About 60% fully conditional or partly conditional. And then also, technology transfer, which countries insisted was very important for both adaptation and mitigation. Countries in sub-Saharan Africa, 7 countries insisted that they needed technology transfer or they were dependent on technology transfer to achieve the adaptation and mitigation goals. And then lastly, you see that the regional share of NDCs with adaptation component, all NDCs submitted in the first round indicated that they needed to address the adaptation goals. So this just shows that there's countries, African countries are putting so much emphasis on adaptation alongside the global development of the net zero goals. And so this means that any global discussions moving forward need to take into consideration how African countries' needs in relation to adaptation can be addressed, but not just adaptation. So it's specifically adaptation finance, but also technology transfer for these countries. But then we see that at COP26, African countries came in with an expectation of, I think in general, in my opinion, 4 things. One is financing for adaptation. And that was in relation to loss and damage, the 1.3 trillion for adaptation after 2025. And then they expected that there'd be a fund created for loss and damage. And they expected that emission reductions moving forward or commitments would be based on historical responsibility and that countries would be allowed to have a development first approach to emission reductions in the long term, where they would peak emissions much, much later. But then the outcome was that, the outcome for COP26 was that there was only a 100 billion commitment that will say that countries, the developed countries would meet the 100 billion goal by 2023, and there was no long-term goal agreed. And then there was loss and damage that was tabled, that was kind of put on the side, and it was said that they would discuss that at COP27, and COP26 kind of came out with limited ambition, with no regard for historical responsibility. So what does this mean actually? So COP26 achieved kind of in a way to keep 1.5 alive. They're kind of there. 1.5 is sort of alive. But then question is, what type of life does it have? Particularly if Africa's needs are not addressed, if Africa's adaptation finance and loss and damage needs are not addressed. And so what I'm arguing here is that for Africa to kind of very much fully support the net zero goals, I think future agreements will need to reflect climate justice needs that are highlighted by African countries. And one of those is kind of having a reframing of net zero to reflect Africa's priorities and capacities. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for that very concise and precise presentation of what the current status is in the African context. We'll come back to you after we go to the next talk by Friederike, and her talk is titled, "We Are in the Era of Loss and Damage." We'll take questions from both of you after her presentation. Welcome, Freddie.
Thank you very much. I feel honored to be invited to this in Insaka, and I think my conclusions at the end will be very similar to what Jessica has just presented. But my main talk will be about the present, because rather than the future of climate change in Africa and in general. Because I think what Jessica has just said is that the African countries and the least developed countries, all of them came with the expectation to this year's COP that loss and damage would finally be somehow meaningfully addressed in the international negotiations. But that was not the case at the end in the decision that was made in Glasgow. And the whole climate change debate, the whole climate change discussion, and also I think what is really reflective of most of the actions that have been decided on in Glasgow are talking about climate change as a future problem, as a problem of future generations, of the future. Whereas, of course, we are long in the era of loss and damage. We already have 1.2 degrees of global warming today, and that has led to changes across the world. So the IPCC, one of the main statements of this year's IPCC report is that every region of the world is experiencing changes because of human-caused climate change. And so when we talk about climate change, we all quite often, especially in the political context and the global negotiations, it's often talked about global temperature goals, 1.5 degrees, as if when we reach 1.5 degrees, suddenly all disasters will break loose, but before then, everything's fine. And that's, of course, not the case. Climate change is not a bomb that will explode at some point, but it is a gradual change that manifests with primarily with changing risks of extreme events and sea level rise. And those who are most vulnerable are currently paying the price of these losses and damages that we have seen over the last decades. And so for the first time, this year's IPCC report that has been published in August has actually addressed, without saying it in so many words, but has actually looked at what losses and damages have already occurred because of human-caused climate change. And what you can see here on this map is, on this hexagon map, is all the regions in the world where we see an observed increase in extreme heat. And in the dots underneath the names of the regions show how much confidence we have that these observed changes are because of human-caused climate change. And you see that in most parts of the world, there are 3 dots because we have high confidence that these changes and heat extremes are because of human-caused climate change. Extreme heat is the extreme where climate change is an absolute game changer and where extremes increase basically everywhere in the world. But it's of course not the only extreme that leads to losses and damages. Another one is heavy rainfall, and Jessica has shown that also for the future, an increase in heavy rainfall is projected, but also in the present, we see in many parts of the world an increase in heavy rainfall, which in this case, the green hexagons show where we have a significant observed increase. But what you can see very strongly on this map is that in particular on the African continent, there are many hexagons which are gray. And these gray hexagons mean that we in the IPCC did not have enough literature to assess that allowed us to draw any conclusions of how climate and extreme weather in particular has changed in these regions. So that doesn't mean that climate change has not happened. It just means that we don't have enough scientific papers that assess changes in these part of the world, so we can't draw any conclusions, because the IPCC, of course, is not doing any research on its own, but what the IPCC authors do is we assess the literature and then draw the conclusions that we can from all the academic papers that have been submitted. And so this shows that there's a huge gap or a huge discrepancy still between what we know about present day climate change and past climate change in the global north compared to the global south. When you look at the same map for agricultural droughts, you can see that there the situation is a bit better in terms of knowledge. There are not so many areas. So the only African area where we don't have enough information is the North Africa, the Sahara region. This is the Arabian Peninsula, which is not strictly Africa. And we also see, this is very important, that of course not all extreme events are getting more likely or more intense because of climate change, because these stripy hexagons mean that there is over the region no significant change in one way or another. That does not mean that within smaller regions, more localized region, we do observe changes because of climate change. So this is for the first time that we have a more or less an overview of what changes regionally we have actually observed and with their attribution to climate change, because we had observed changes before, but not the information on what the cause of these changes was, if that was natural variability or if it was human caused climate change. But what you also see here, that in most cases there's just one dot for the attribution statement, which means that we do have low confidence. And that is again because there is very limited literature in many cases, so that we can't take very confident conclusions. And that's not only true for Africa in this case, but in most parts of the world. But so this is on a regional level, but of course, people don't live in continents or the global mean, or even on large regions, but people live in cities, in villages, in local environments. And we have more knowledge than is shown in the IPCC overview figures for localized extreme events and parts of the world. And so how do we get to this knowledge? The first thing I would like to highlight is that climate change is not a dichotomy. It's not a yes or no question. It's not this event was caused by climate change or this famine was caused by climate change or not. The way how climate change affects weather is that it alters the likelihood and intensity, but all extreme events have always multiple causes. And whether and to what extent these extreme events, when they happen, independent of they have a climate change signal or not, turn into disasters, strongly depends on the level of vulnerability and exposure. And so we can now find out how extreme events have changed because of climate change. And to do that, which you can see in this schematic here, is that we basically look at what is possible weather in the world we live in today, which is indicated here as the red distribution, and compare that with possible weather in the world that might have been without climate change. And because we know very well how many greenhouse gases have been put into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we can remove these these extra greenhouse gases from the climate model's atmospheres and are thus able to simulate the world that might have been without climate change. You can do the same thing for other drivers of extreme events. So another important factor in extreme events and how extreme or how intense an extreme event is, particularly for droughts, but also heat waves, is land use changes. So you could also simulate possible weather in the world that has the land use with the deforestation levels that it has today, and compare that to a world that has higher levels of forest, for example, so that you can, so this methodology, in theory, very straightforward methodology, allows you to disentangle different drivers from extremes and find out how much is the role of climate change, but also how much is the role of other potential drivers. Of course, this is the theory, and there in practice, this often, how much or how well you can do it strongly depends on the availability of data. So there are some examples where climate change is an absolute game changer in the event to occur. So probably everyone has heard of the heat wave in Canada. That was an event that would have been impossible without human-caused climate change. But for other events, and this is a study that we have just published with my team this week, like the drought in southern Madagascar, climate change is not the main driver of the event, but the event is an extreme event. It's a very rare event, expected to happen less than once in 100 years, but it's still within the natural variability. But of course, it is affecting a population and a region that has a very, very high vulnerability. And so even smallest changes in rainfall can lead to huge impacts in the area. But which means that when you look at loss and damage and adaptation needs, it highlights that in many parts of the world, we are not even adapted to today's climate, which is really important to understand when taking into account how to deal, what to do for adaptation in the future, what to include in adaptation plans. And so just one aspect that is also really important. I have shown before the IPCC figures, which have shown just how our knowledge about extreme events that have been recorded and that have where literature was published. And but of course, before you can write a scientific paper, you need the data to actually be able to base the paper on. And that's not just weather observations, but it's also just, you need to know that some extreme events have happened. And we know from projections, from observations, that, for example, heat extremes are increasing everywhere and particularly strongly increasing in Africa. But when you look at the global database that records disasters called EMDAT, and you look at Africa, you see that there are basically no heat waves recorded, which doesn't mean that no heat waves have happened. It's just that they are not registered by local authorities or by NGOs, so they don't end up in databases, they don't end up in the global research community, and so they are not on anyone's radar. And so if you want to develop adaptation plans, heat extremes will not be, or heat waves will not be the first thing that people will address, because they don't seem to happen. But of course they do. And when you compare that to observational data here, for example, there were a very strong heat wave in large parts of southern Africa that was actually labeled as a drought in the database, but it was a heat wave. And so this is really important to understand when you want to understand what to prepare for and how to address this. And so to come back to COP26 and what lies ahead, there were two outcomes, I think, that were particularly important for Africa. And the one that Jessica already mentioned is that climate finance, the final decision says that they note with deep regret that the goal of the developed countries to mobilize the 100 billion per year has not been reached. And so this is, this is just even that goal that has been set even before this COP has not been reached. And then also loss and damage has been postponed again to COP27. So climate justice has been mentioned a lot in COP, but particularly striking I found listening to Timmermans, so the European Union's leader. He was talking about justice all the time, but he was all the time talking about his grandson. So intergenerational justice seems to be the only interpretation that the developed countries have taken on board. But actually international justice is at least as important and crucial to move forward, is something that still seems to be forgotten. And so I think we have to address these questions, and we have to also provide more scientific evidence that no one can just ignore loss and damage anymore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Freddie, for making the gravity of the problem very concrete and very real. And we shall move swiftly into the Q&A. And actually, I'm going to start with you, Freddie, because you make a very strong point there about how data plays into action and how lack of it is problematic. I wondered if you could say a bit more about what the actual challenges around collecting the data, because the problem is very real in Africa. It's not as though people are not aware of it, or they're not experiencing the extreme weather events happening and everybody's aware of it. But the collection of data seems to be lagging behind, yet it has, there's a strong case for data to be able to make, not just take actions that, that can repair the damage, but to make a strong case globally for change. What are the actual problems around data collection?
So I think there's on the one hand the problem that just weather data is often actually, it exists, but it's not fed into publicly available databases, and sometimes it's not free to use, so you have to pay for it, which precludes researchers particularly to use the data. And I think so that's for the observational data. And the WMO has actually, before COP, announced that they will make a big push to have their member states making data more available, more publicly available. And so if that would be fantastic if through the WMO, so the World Meteorological Organization, if they could mobilize their member states to show just how beneficial it is for the states to make the data available rather than just sell it so that's I think one thing. And that's really not just Africa. There are also many countries in Europe that don't share their data, where we actually have very similar problems, that it's difficult to get access to the data. And the other problem is that, for example, for this disaster database, that in many developing countries, the reporting is done by NGOs and not by the governments. And so the NGOs only report that what interests them. And so NGOs are very used to mobilize funds or for droughts and floods, because there the impacts are pretty obvious. But for example, for heat waves, people don't die just on the street. They usually die in their poorly insulated houses and are just not visible. And so it's not on the radar of the NGOs and the government. And so I think just having I think it is an awareness issue for the heat waves. But I think the biggest problem is that the IPCC is only assessing academic literature. And many researchers in Africa that totally have the intellectual capacity, the education and everything, but they are employed not to do research, but they are employed to do teaching or to deliver a service, but not to do research. So I think that that's something which, so there's just not enough people who write these papers that we can then assess.
Yeah, there's a capacity problem as well. I'll just very quickly ask Jessica to chime in, because Jessica, I think you're making a point that was not dissimilar when you're talking about the reporting of nationally determined contribution, the National Adaptation Plan and so on. And you also linked it to, so you termed it as there being hesitancy, but then you also spoke about the funding element, which clearly there is a discrepancy between what is needed and what has been proposed. How do you think that plays into the not reporting side of things?
What do you mean not reporting?
So because you indicated that the reporting is not up to scratch, so there's hesitancy around reporting. Is that linked to financing, or there are many other, financing is not an issue in the reporting element?
I think yeah, so there's a bit of lag in making commitments for net zero. And I think one of the main underlying reason is the loss of trust in the capacity of the global system for governing climate change to deliver on its promises. And so a lot of them, in my opinion, so a lot of the countries are kind of holding back to see how net zero develops so that they do not commit to a goal that they will not be able to address, or also overcommitting, because one, global climate action needs to be to reflect historical emissions, and that's what African countries have been emphasizing for as many years as we can remember, and so they don't want to make commitments that do not reflect that that historical responsibility, where those who've created climate change, those who've emitted the most, are taking out, they are most responsible for making it better, for making it right. And so and I think part of that is that also I've been reading a bit of work that says that also there's that limited capacity to do the long-term planning within these countries. And so kind of figuring out how to do long-term emission planning, long-term adaptation planning, that's very significant capacity gap that is really not addressed within the current global climate governance mechanism. And so that links very much to what Freddie was saying, that you can see significant capacity gaps at different levels, both at the national, but also within municipalities and cities, but also within localities.
Yeah, and if I can just follow on with you, Jessica, is there an African Union Continental strategic plan in relation to net zero and adaptation?
The African Union definitely has. Usually regional institutions will also work with the regional members, with their members, to create adaptation plans. But eventually, most of these build on what countries actually commit to doing, because, for example, the East African community or the African Union will not just wake up one day and decide that the whole continent will go net zero. It can't do that. It needs buy-in from each of the member countries. And so before these goals are committed, each country has to say what they'll do to get to there. And that's what we're seeing. And so we're seeing the African Union, the African Development Bank, we're also seeing some other sub-regional organizations work with their member countries to see where the gaps are and kind of try to coordinate action across, from the international level, both to the local level, to ensure that their needs are met, but also reflected in not just national strategies for adaptation and mitigation, but also in the regional strategies. I'm not sure if that makes sense, though.
Yeah, and that question of meeting the needs, seeing as Africa contributes very little to total carbon emissions, should it not be focusing on mitigation and adaptation?
So that's, I think, so over the last few COPs, that's been the main message. And even not just at COPs, at regional forums, in forums that are not, in development forums like like at Davos, I think that's the main thing, that Africa has contributed very little to emissions, and so Africa should get that opportunity to develop first. And the development first is strongly a very strong condition for global climate action. Problem is that it's not reflected in global climate commitments. So we see the development first need kind of being overlooked, and countries are being asked to make net zero commitments. And some of these net zero and because of that, because these needs are not kind of addressed, because the development first needs are not addressed, we see there's a likelihood that the net zero commitments coming from African countries are least likely to be met, because they need to develop. And so there's if net zero does not recognize that, then net zero will not be met. But also B, there's very significant capacity gaps that are not accounted for. And even when they're accounted for, there's very limited resources available, and there's no really vision for providing these resources to make sure that these capacity gaps are addressed. For example, there's South Africa and Nigeria have made net zero commitments, but then when you look further into them, you realize that they'll need a lot of resources that are not currently being thought of at the international level.
Thanks. And Freddie, just to follow on that point of, the required resources to do a proper job, on climate justice, how realistic is it to expect that rich countries will really accept the concept of reparations or dealing with the loss and damage?
I think it's not very realistic to expect that because the fact that loss and damage is at all in the Paris Agreement is, I think, just because, so in Article 8 of the Paris Agreement, loss and damage is particularly acknowledged, and this is sort of a third pillar between, amongst adaptation and mitigation that needs to be addressed. But then in the declaration following that, in Article 52, it says that loss and damage does not mean compensation. And I think that makes it very unlikely that there will be, in a true sense, a reparation framework. And what also is really hindering loss and damage to be addressed is that in the UN negotiations, loss and damage is not defined, and it's deliberately not defined so that all the parties sort of can address to it. But of course, for developed countries, loss and damage means something very different to the developing countries, who just see that as a new fancy term to think about risks, whereas it is very much the materialized risks, but that is nowhere defined, and so it's very difficult to actually have a mechanism to say, well, we now give you funding for loss and damage, because it's not clear what it actually is. And I think this is something where the research community can probably really help. There's at the moment very little research on loss and damage, but I think coming up with frameworks that could work within the Paris Agreement, and that show ways forward of how it could be defined and addressed, that will help the developing countries, so that there is serious financial and also technology transfer, but without calling it reparations, I think would be really important for there to be move forward.
Yeah, and if loss and damage is not defined as you've clearly explained, is there then an accepted methodology for calculating loss and damage, or are we still completely far away from that?
Sorry.
How is you've said that loss and damage is not clearly defined. So I was just wondering, is there no methodology there for calculating loss and damage?
Not in so many terms, no. So there's the Warsaw mechanism for damage, and there has been which sort of talks about extreme events and slow onset events. So it's definitely there's some framework, but it's not very concrete. So you can't clearly say that this is loss and damage, and therefore, or this country has experienced loss and damage, and therefore should be getting funding. And I think that's it just recognizes sort of the kind of things that could count as loss and damage, but not, or could cause loss and damage, but not really how then those losses and damages are going to be addressed. And so other countries like Bangladesh, for example, also a country that has huge impacts from climate change, they have decided to make their own national loss and damage mechanism because nothing much was happening. And I think Kenya has also discussed that. And so I think these are really important things to look at and to develop, because if we can show that there is a way that works, then it could also be something that can be included in the international negotiations.
Yeah, and what seems to be coming through here in both the remarks you've made is that this inability to sort of pull together scientific evidence because of this vagueness around loss and damage and the methodology for calculating it has in some way hampered commitments and actually international debate. So it seems as though it's part of the problem why there's a lot of sort of struggle in terms of the difference between what is actually needed and the rhetoric. How do you think this could be disentangled? Because it seems as though there's an advantage to keeping things vague. At the same time, there's this obvious problem that needs to be dealt with, and it would rely on having clear information with clear methodology, with clear understanding of what is actually going on.
This is a really tough question, and I don't think I really have an answer to that. And of course, I think the fact that we don't really have evidence is really not helping. But we have learned long enough that just having information doesn't lead to action either. So there also need to be the political the political will on all sides, which of course is even more difficult. So, but in for mitigation, we have a global inventory on emissions. We have clearly defined metrics on how to calculate emissions, and so I think what would be really wrong would be to say, okay, you have to do an attribution study, and if climate change plays a role, you get loss and damage funding. That would be absolutely the wrong thing, because of course the losses and damages and how you're able to deal with them are dependent on your vulnerability and exposure. And so that it can't be a mechanism that ignores southern Madagascar because climate change did not play a big role in the drought, but gives funds to the US. So I think that's the wrong kind of evidence, or that would be clearly the wrong thing to do. So it would need to be tied to responsibilities and needs in some way. But I don't, if I knew how to, I would have long written that paper. But I think it's really something where we as a research community could do some work. Not me personally so much, perhaps.
Let's see, Jessica, you might have some insights on how this tussle can be dealt with.
I'm not so much of an expert on loss and damage. I'm still very new to this, but one of the ways I think to get conversations going is to is what we saw at COP26, a solidarity approach, which has been proposed by a few researchers in the past, and it may kind of just get things moving a bit. And so where countries show solidarity with those that have been severely affected by climate change losses and damages. And I think Scotland showed solidarity by committing funds to that. We had, I think there was another institution that did that also. So I think another institution put in under 3 million or so. And I mean, 4 million is not even enough to cover losses and damages for, say, even a village somewhere. But then solidarity will kind of, will act to begin to unlock some of the kind of the, what do you call it, the gridlocks that have prevented progress so far, kind of prevented progress in negotiations so far. How that plays out in the long term, I think it's not a permanent solution. And so, it's just a starting point.
Yeah, and actually, I'm going to stay with you, Jessica, for a minute, because the solidarity approach is clearly something that could help in pushing the needle. But there was a mention of political will. And what we're increasingly seeing in Africa are people like Vanessa Nakati from Uganda, who are out there really trying, to get the political side of things to pay attention to what is going on. And of course, there's a lot of activism around the world by, young people really trying to, push things forward. But generally speaking, normally politics tries, at least in places where there are democracies, tends to follow what is happening or what is in popular demand. How far do you think this level of activism you're beginning to see in Africa is likely to help on that end of things?
I think it will. It's a good thing that that groups in Africa are becoming more vocal and more visible actually to the global audience, because to be honest, there's a lot of the activism we've seen is from the global north, and that is worrying because it paints a very wrong picture about what climate change is and what experiences are. But then even I think there's the political awareness, but also the political will probably create some more pressure on negotiations. But then even then, I still feel like I still don't know how these will go, because Africa is in a catch-22 situation. It's where negotiations are just too slow for actual progress on climate change. But it's also, and so negotiations are really not delivering the change that Africa needs in relation to adaptation and loss and damage and financing for both. But also, if Africa walks away from this, it's definitely going to suffer. And so being kind of held in such a situation means that you need to find innovative ways to address your immediate needs, but also be in a position to negotiate on your long-term needs. And I think this is where we need experts in both relations, in international relations, but also experts in other areas to come together and figure out how does Africa kind of leverage its agency, its role in the global world, not just its role right now, but also its future role. And so Africa could kind of use its role in the world to negotiate for a better outcome in relation to not just development, but also climate action.
Freddie, is activism having an impact at all in Africa by the likes of Vanessa and other people?
I think it's hard for me to say if it has an impact in Africa, but I think it definitely, people like Vanessa have definitely, I think, an impact outside of Africa, in that Africa is, and Africa's youth particularly, is more heard, and it's more that I think the fact that it's not just about intergenerational but international justice, and is that is such a big aspect of the whole climate youth movement, is because of the participation of the African groups particularly, and they're really amazing efforts to be at these global at the global summits and to be there and make sure that Africa's voice is heard. And so I think while it is the action from the global north and from the international negotiations isn't following the rhetoric, but I think talking about it and having these issues and these justice issues on the table is the first necessary step. And I think that's what they are achieving.
Yeah, okay, thanks. We're now drawing to a close. So I'm going to ask each of you to give us a takeaway message. I'll start with you, Jessica.
My takeaway message is African countries, stakeholders will be really critical for getting to net zero, for the long-term goal for keeping temperatures well below 2 degrees. And so we need to figure out how to do that in a way that delivers on climate justice well in advance, so that before it's too late. And so it's about urgency, but also urgency for the global goal and urgency for climate justice. Thank you.
Freddie?
I think my main message is that when, and of course I say that as a scientist, we need, when we talk about funding and funding needs, we need to think about long-term capacity needs, and we need more African scientists in the IPCC. We need more African scientists within the negotiations that are able to, because we still have a completely distorted picture of what climate change actually means.
Okay, thank you. It remains for me to thank our speakers today, and also a big thank you to the audience for joining us. And as the year draws to a close, would like to wish you a wonderful Christmas break. Now, we will be convening Insaka Talks this coming year. Whether this will be physical or virtual will depend on the prevailing situation. But we'll be sharing specific details on this well in advance via our mailing list. If you're not already on our mailing list and would like to sign up, you can do so by going on our website, and Zimpande, my colleague, is going to share the link with you in the chat just now. So thank you everybody for joining us today, and we shall look forward to seeing you again early next year. Have a good Christmas season and goodbye.